Senator Roberts.
Thank you. I speak in support of this motion from One Nation to enshrine into the Constitution the most basic of human rights, the right to free speech. When it comes to free speech, One Nation has your back. Many people believe that free speech is an existing feature of the Australian legal and social framework. It's not. The High Court has held that there is limited freedom of speech implied by the interaction of several sections of the Constitution, limited to political communication. The extent of this limited right is yet to be fully determined by the High Court. That being the case, this concept of the right to free speech, already enshrined in the American Constitution, would be a worthy improvement to our own Australian Constitution. I want to read from the motion that Senator Hanson and I have moved, that the following matters be referred to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee for inquiry and report by 1st of September 2024. The matter of a public vote in the form of a referendum on the matter of enshrining the right to free speech in the Australian Constitution, with particular reference to an assessment of the content and implications of a question to be put to the electors, an examination of the resources required to enact such an activity, including the question of the contribution of Commonwealth funding to the yes and no campaigns, an assessment of the impact of the timing of such an activity, including the opportunity for it to coincide with a general election, and fourth, any other related matters. This is fairly simple. It's just an investigation and inquiry. Of course, any alteration to our Constitution must be done with the agreement of the Australian voters by way of a referendum. I know that the Australian people are sick of referendums, particularly since the doomed and expensive voice debacle that we had to endure, and that Labor government poured more than $450 million down the gurgler when it could have been spent on something far more important. Yet ensuring freedom of speech is a feature of our social and legal landscape and would be worth it. Why do we need it? In Australia, we're significantly over-governed and over-regulated. One area that needs attention is the way that the government used the media to shut down anyone who wishes to discuss any concept that does not follow the government line. In these woke times, governments maintain a strong hand guiding the media into accepting and promoting often truly dumb, and in some instances factually wrong propositions. And we know that freedom of speech is suppressed because local newspapers, state newspapers, rely for funding on advertising from local councils and state governments, and the same with the national government, the federal government. And so if someone comes up with an article that is too much out of government line, then the governments won't advertise. What we've also seen, in addition to some factually wrong propositions from federal, state and governments, we see propositions that undermine good governance and cede sovereignty. Ridiculous, pushing a globalist agenda. Social media platforms have taken on the roles of pseudo-fact-checkers and censors of material, deleting material that's deemed inappropriate, even if it's accurate and is disclosing inconvenient truths. Truth doesn't matter to government in Australia anymore. As an example, YouTube recently took down material from my YouTube channel, including COVID vaccine or COVID injection injuries, that it had deemed medical misinformation. This was unnecessary and possibly unlawful, as some of the information was material placed before the Senate, covered by parliamentary privilege and supported by proof of its truth, fully referenced. And it's been up there for 6 months. Once I started mentioning COVID Royal Commission, it's suddenly come down, and they've taken it back retrospectively. 6 months' worth of work that this Senate has seen and has witnessed, and somehow political speech from the Senate is censored by YouTube, a foreign corporation meddling in Australian federal politics. Not the first time. This interference with the communication of parliamentary material is potentially an offence, but it's not covered by any laws simply guaranteeing freedom of speech. Freedom of speech should still be moderated on rare occasions to exclude poisonous vilification or speech that promotes hate or other crimes. Not something that might offend someone, That's a dumbing down of the Australian population. Anyone's feelings are hurt. You cannot give offence, you can only take offence. If someone says something in the chamber and I feel offended, that's my responsibility. It's not theirs. So we should be stopping this nonsense about someone feeling offended being able to shut down the other person. It's the speech that considers alternative narratives or theories that deserves protection. This Labor government has done nothing to improve transparency and accountability in terms of government actions. Indeed, in terms of guillotines, shutting down of debate, we've had major bills go through this parliament with not one word of debate, with major amendments voted on with not one word of debate or question. That's not democracy. This Labor government has done nothing, as I said, to improve transparency and accountability in terms of government actions. During the COVID period of government failure, the government of the time moved into a period of hyperactivity, silencing critics and preventing any discussion of problems, COVID injection injuries, which there were many, and alternative treatments, resulting in many needless preventable deaths, in the tens of thousands of needless preventable deaths, and injuries in the hundreds of thousands to innocent Australians. That was what the Liberal National Party did. Two cheeks of the same backside. Of particular concern is the Labor government's intention to introduce a bill to eliminate alleged disinformation or misinformation, with no identified deciders as to whether the information is based on truth or not. Who cares about the truth? Just shut it down. It goes against the government's narrative. And who introduced the misinformation-disinformation bill? That's right, the other cheek, the Liberal National Party. So Labor, they introduced it, didn't put it to the vote. Labor Party came along into a government and they introduced it again, same bill pretty much. This misinformation-disinformation bill must be opposed. It represents government censorship at its worst. And it's just a control agenda that's occurring in so many Western countries. And I compliment Tucker Carlson for his courage in speaking the truth. It's happening largely to the Anglophile nations, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, America and Australia, to some extent in Europe, but it's largely the descendants of the British Commonwealth. Usually we'd rely upon state or Commonwealth legislation to resolve this issue of ensuring freedom of speech. Yet since Federation, this has not been done properly by either of these jurisdictions, state or federal. It's now high time to ensure once and for all that this protection can be established. It can be done. We need this inquiry. By calling for a committee for inquiry to report to the Senate assessments on content, process, resources required, timing and any other matters related may be brought back to the Senate for consideration. Freedom of speech, if enshrined within the Constitution, will provide greater real freedoms to all Australians. And of all the freedoms, well, let's go through some of the freedoms. We've got freedom to live, freedom of life, freedom of belief, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of travel, freedom of exchange, freedom of initiative. Of all of those freedoms, freedom of life is arguably number one, but they don't get off the ground without freedom of speech. Speech is first. It's a freedom, these freedoms are birthrights, universal rights. And yet we now come to the government and ask permission to speak freely, or we get censored. That means it's not a right anymore. It's something that we have to get permission from the government, whether it be Labor or Liberal Nationals. But think about this. The most remarkable transformation of human civilization on this planet occurred in the last 170 years. 170 years. Prior to that, our ancestors were shuffling around, scratching in the dirt. And now look where we are. Human progress has come because of human creativity and human care. They're inherent in people. People want to do things better, quicker, smarter and easier, more easily. So someone comes up with an idea. Through freedom of speech, they share the idea. And this happened so much in America and Britain in the 19th century and even in the 18th century. The ideas were shared. So one person comes up with an idea, another person, by sharing it, builds upon the idea, and makes it more magnificent. And then someone else comes along and takes their idea and makes an initiative out of it and transforms human civilization. This is a matter of life and death. Freedom of speech is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of human progress. I support this motion.